My daughter died 8 years ago. Every single January since the day we buried her, I wired her husband $55,000 to ensure my only granddaughter had the best tutors, the warmest coats, and a life entirely untouched by financial grief. Yesterday, I stood in his freezing hallway, watching that same grandchild shrink away from him. She grabbed my sleeve, her knuckles white, and whispered, "Grandpa, do not send Dad any more money. Just follow him, you will see." What I discovered next terrified me and shattered everything I thought I knew. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect your blood from someone wearing the mask of a family member. I am Stephen Gallagher, 63 years old, and until yesterday, I believed I was buying peace of mind. The morning began like every other anniversary of the payout. I sat at my solid oak desk, logged into my secure banking portal, and authorized the $55,000 transfer to Colin Fletcher. The confirmation screen flashed green. The funds vanished from my retirement account, supposedly destined for the private academy tuition and living expenses that Colin swore he could not afford alone. I closed the laptop, grabbed my coat, and drove across town to see the investment for myself. The drive took me out of the manicured streets of my neighborhood and into the aging suburban sprawl where Colin insisted on keeping the house. He always claimed he wanted to maintain the environment my daughter had set up. But as I pulled into the cracked asphalt driveway, the facade crumbled. The gutters hung loose, choked with dead leaves. The front lawn was a patchwork of frostbitten weeds. I stepped out of my truck, the freezing January wind cutting through my wool coat. I walked up the concrete steps and pressed the doorbell. It did not chime. It just emitted a dull, broken buzz. Colin opened the door. He did not smile. He stood blocking the entryway, holding a steaming mug of artisanal coffee. He wore a crisp, tailored cashmere sweater that easily cost $1,000, a stark contrast to the peeling paint on the doorframe behind him. He looked down at my boots, annoyed by my unannounced arrival. "You could have texted Stephen," he said, not stepping aside. "I am right in the middle of preparing quarterly tax projections." "I just sent the annual wire," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I wanted to see my granddaughter. Bring her to the door." Colin sighed heavily, rolling his eyes as if my presence was an unbearable tax on his time. He stepped back, gesturing toward the living room with a flick of his wrist. I walked inside. The temperature in the house was instantly shocking. It was colder inside than it was on the front porch. I glanced at the hallway thermostat. The digital display was dark, completely powered off. "Wait here," Colin muttered, turning his back on me. He walked toward the kitchen, his expensive Italian leather loafers clicking sharply against the cheap, scuffed laminate flooring. I stood alone in the barren living room. There were no photographs on the walls. The furniture consisted of a single sagging couch and a television mounted crookedly above a dusty fireplace. Then I heard the quiet shuffle of footsteps on the stairs. Lily came down slowly. She was 10 years old, but she looked much smaller. Her collarbones protruded sharply against the neckline of a faded, oversized sweatshirt that belonged to a much older child. The sleeves were frayed at the cuffs. She wore thin cotton leggings and no socks. She shivered as she stepped onto the freezing floorboards. This was the girl I had just spent $55,000 to protect. I dropped to one knee, ignoring the shooting pain in my joints, and opened my arms. Lily rushed into them, burying her face in my shoulder. She felt incredibly frail. Her ribs pressed against my chest. "I missed you, Grandpa," she mumbled into my coat. I pulled back, examining her face. Dark circles bruised the skin under her eyes. Her skin was pale, lacking the flush of a healthy child. I opened my mouth to ask her why the heat was off, why she looked like she had not eaten a proper meal in weeks. But before I could speak, Colin strode back into the room. His smartphone was pressed to his ear. He held up a single index finger to me, a universal gesture of dismissal. "Yes, I need to take this," Colin said loudly into the phone, turning away from us and walking toward the kitchen door. "The merger details are completely wrong. Give me 2 minutes to pull up the spreadsheet." He stepped into the kitchen and pushed the door partially closed. The moment his back disappeared, the atmosphere in the living room shifted. Lily stopped shivering. Her posture changed from passive exhaustion to sheer desperate urgency. She stepped closer to me, looking frantically over her shoulder toward the kitchen. She reached out and grabbed the sleeve of my coat. Her small fingers dug into the wool with surprising strength. She pulled me down closer to her face. I leaned in, expecting her to ask for food or tell me she was cold. "Grandpa, do not send Dad any more money," she whispered. Her voice was barely a breath, but it carried the absolute certainty of an adult. I froze. I looked into her eyes. There was no childish confusion there. There was only raw terror. "What are you talking about, Lily?" I asked softly, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Just follow him," she whispered, her eyes darting back to the kitchen door. "Follow him when he leaves. You will see." The kitchen door swung open violently. Colin marched back in, shoving his phone into his pocket. His jaw was tight. The brief moment of vulnerability shattered. Lily instantly dropped my sleeve and stepped back, looking down at the floorboards, her shoulders slumping. "That was work," Colin snapped, his tone devoid of any apology. "An absolute disaster with the overseas accounts. I have to go to the office right now to fix this. The visit is over, Stephen. We have errands to run anyway." He grabbed a heavy winter coat from the rack and tossed it toward Lily without looking at her. She caught it clumsily. "I just got here, Colin," I said, standing up slowly. "We can go get lunch. I will pay." "No," Colin said, stepping aggressively toward the front door and pulling it open. The freezing wind blasted into the hallway again. "Lily needs to study. I am locking up. Goodbye." He was not asking me to leave. He was evicting me. I looked at Lily one last time. She did not look up. She simply zipped her coat. I walked past Colin, stepping out onto the frost-covered porch. He slammed the door behind me before I even reached the bottom step. I heard the deadbolt slide into place with a heavy metallic crack. I walked to my truck. I did not feel the cold anymore. I climbed into the driver's seat and closed the door. I did not turn the key in the ignition. I sat in the silence of the cabin, staring at the peeling front door of that decaying house. I thought about the $55,000 sitting in his account. I thought about his $1,000 sweater. I thought about the absolute terror in my granddaughter's eyes. The heater in my truck remained off. I needed the cold to keep my mind sharp. Minutes bled into one another. The suburban street was dead quiet, typical for a Tuesday morning, when everyone else was working honest jobs. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel, squeezing, until my knuckles matched the color of Lily's when she grabbed my coat. I replayed the last 8 years in my head. Rachel's sudden illness, the chaotic hospital visits, the devastating funeral where Colin wept loudly, leaning heavily on my shoulder, playing the part of the shattered widower flawlessly. I remembered the day he came to me, eyes bloodshot, handing me a stack of utility bills and mortgage notices, claiming Rachel's life insurance policy had been voided due to a missed premium payment. I had not questioned it. I had simply opened my checkbook. I had funded his grief, believing I was shielding my granddaughter from the fallout. But the child standing in that freezing living room was not shielded. She was a hostage. The heavy wooden door of the house finally opened. Colin stepped out. He was alone. He locked the deadbolt from the outside, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He walked briskly down the driveway, completely ignoring my truck, parked just 2 houses down. He did not look like a man heading to a stressful emergency meeting at an accounting firm. His posture was relaxed, arrogant. He approached a sleek, black luxury sedan parked on the street. I had never seen that car before. He always drove a sensible, mid-sized hybrid when he came to visit me. He pressed a button on his key fob, and the sedan chirped, the side mirrors folding out automatically. He slid into the driver's seat, and the powerful engine roared to life, a deep rumbling purr that shattered the quiet neighborhood. I waited until his brake lights vanished around the first corner. Then I turned my key. The engine of my truck fired up. I pulled away from the curb, keeping a safe distance, letting two other cars pull in between us as we navigated the winding suburban roads. The anger inside me was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating focus. I was no longer a grieving father or a generous grandfather. I was a hunter, and the hunt had just begun. The brake lights of the black sedan flared red at the intersection before making a sharp right turn. I shifted my truck into drive and eased my foot onto the accelerator. My heart beat with a slow, heavy rhythm. I had never followed a person in my life. I was a retired man who spent his days reading historical biographies and tending to a small garden. Stalking my own son-in-law felt like stepping off a cliff into total darkness. A part of me wanted to turn around. A part of me wanted to go back to my quiet house and pretend this morning was just a misunderstanding. But the image of Lily standing in that freezing living room, with her frayed sleeves and bruised eyes, anchored me to the steering wheel. She had asked me to follow him. I owed it to Rachel's memory to see where the money was really going. I kept two cars between my truck and his sedan. The morning traffic was thick enough to hide me, but sparse enough that I never lost sight of his vehicle. We drove out of the decaying suburban sprawl. The cracked pavements and dying lawns faded away in the rearview mirror. We merged onto the interstate, heading straight for the city center. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly, my hands ached. As I watched his expensive car weave effortlessly through the lanes, a sickening memory bubbled up from the darkest corner of my mind. It was the second Tuesday after Rachel's funeral. The house was still filled with the scent of lilies and stale coffee from the wake. Colin had come over unannounced. He looked completely destroyed. He sat at my kitchen table and buried his face in his hands. He told me that Rachel's life insurance policy was worthless. He wept as he explained a clerical error. He claimed Rachel had missed a single signature on a renewal form a month before she got sick. He said the insurance company voided the entire policy on a technicality. There was no safety net. There was no college fund for Lily. There was nothing but medical debt and the threat of bankruptcy. I remembered sitting across from him feeling the bottom drop out of my world. Rachel had been so careful. She was an actuary. She understood risk better than anyone. It made no sense that she would let her policy lapse. But grief makes you blind. Grief makes you desperate to fix whatever is left broken. I did not ask to see the rejection letters from the insurance company. I did not call my own lawyer to investigate the claim. I just looked at this sobbing man who had lost his wife, and I promised him that Lily would never suffer. I told him I would step in and fill the gap. I had wired him the first $55,000 the very next morning. For 8 years, I believed that story. I believed I was the only thing keeping my granddaughter's life afloat. Now, as I watched Colin accelerate past a semi-truck, with the careless ease of a man who did not have a single financial worry in the world, the truth began to solidify in my chest. There was no paperwork error. Rachel had not made a mistake. The money had paid out. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. He had stolen her legacy, and then he had come to my kitchen table to steal my retirement. We exited the interstate and entered the downtown district. The landscape transformed completely. We left behind the middle-class office parks and entered the platinum sector of the city. The buildings here were towering monoliths of steel and reflective glass. The sidewalks were lined with manicured trees and high-end designer boutiques. This was not the financial district where his supposed accounting firm was located. There were no mid-level corporate offices here. This was the ultra-exclusive residential zone. The black sedan slowed down and signaled a right turn. Colin pulled into a private cobblestone alleyway flanked by thick concrete planters that acted as security barricades. I could not follow him down that alley without being completely obvious. I drove past the entrance and quickly parallel parked my truck in a loading zone across the wide avenue. I turned off the engine and rolled down my window just an inch to let the cold air keep me awake. I watched through the gap as Colin parked his car in a designated premium space. He stepped out and locked the vehicle. He did not rush. He did not look like a frantic employee running late for a disastrous overseas merger meeting. He strolled casually toward the entrance of the massive glass skyscraper. He carried himself with an arrogance that belonged to a billionaire. The entrance to the building was not a standard lobby door. It was a solid panel of brushed steel set flush against the glass. There was no handle and no keyhole. Colin approached a sleek black pedestal mounted into the wall. He placed his right thumb against a glowing blue glass pad. A moment later, a soft green light illuminated his face. The heavy steel door slid open silently on an automated track. A man in a pristine, tailored uniform stood just inside the lobby. I could clearly see the concierge greet Colin with a deep, respectful nod. The concierge reached out and handed Colin a stack of thick envelopes that looked like high-priority mail. Colin smiled, took the mail, and walked past the concierge toward a bank of private elevators. The steel door glided shut behind him, sealing him inside a fortress of extreme wealth. I sat in my cold truck with the engine off, staring at the reflection of the clouds in the side of that skyscraper. My mind worked through the logistics of what I had just witnessed. You do not use a biometric scanner to visit a client. You do not receive personal mail at a corporate meeting. That building was residential. The security alone indicated a price tag in the millions. Colin did not work downtown. He lived here. He maintained the freezing, broken-down house in the suburbs as a prop. It was a miserable stage set where he kept my granddaughter imprisoned just to keep the wire transfers coming. My hands stopped shaking. The shock and the betrayal completely burned away, leaving nothing but a vast, empty landscape of pure resolve. I had spent 8 years treating him like a fragile, grieving son. He had spent 8 years treating me like an endless bank account while starving my only grandchild. He thought he was untouchable behind that biometric steel door. He thought his lies were perfectly constructed. He did not know that I was sitting across the street dismantling his illusion piece by piece. The first shadow had been cast on his perfect life, and I was going to find out exactly who was living in that penthouse with the money that belonged to my dead daughter. I sat in the loading zone for 20 minutes, just watching the heavy steel door of that glass monolith. My mind was racing, but my breathing was slow and steady. I needed to get inside. I needed to see what was behind that biometric scanner. I looked around the cab of my truck. Behind the passenger seat, I had an old yellow high-visibility safety vest from my days doing volunteer road cleanup and a battered metal clipboard I used to track my garden supplies. It was not much of a disguise, but I knew from decades of working in construction management that if you walk with enough authority, people rarely question your right to be there. I slipped the vest over my wool coat and grabbed the clipboard. I stepped out of the truck and crossed the wide avenue. The wind whipped down the street, stinging my face, but I did not slow my pace. I walked straight up to the massive glass facade, bypassing the biometric scanner and heading for the discreet service door located just to the right of the main entrance. I pressed the intercom button. A moment later, a voice crackled through the speaker, asking for my purpose. I kept my voice flat and irritated. I said I was the delivery coordinator for a premium Italian furniture importer and that my drivers were stuck at a way station. I told the voice I needed to verify the freight elevator dimensions and confirm the client details before my team arrived with a custom marble dining table. The lock clicked and the heavy door buzzed open. I stepped into a long, brightly lit service corridor that connected directly to the rear of the main lobby. As I rounded the corner, the sheer opulence of the building hit me. The air was thick with the scent of expensive sandalwood and fresh lilies. The floors were seamless white marble that reflected the soft ambient light from crystal chandeliers above. The contrast was physically nauseating. Just an hour ago, I was standing in a house so cold I could see my own breath. I thought about Lily shivering in her oversized frayed sweatshirt while her father walked through this heated, perfumed palace. The concierge who had greeted Colin earlier was standing behind a massive curved mahogany desk. He looked up as I approached, his eyes narrowing slightly at my yellow vest. I did not give him time to question me. I walked right up to the desk, slapped my metal clipboard down on the polished wood, and sighed heavily. I told him my dispatch office had completely messed up the paperwork for the penthouse delivery. I said I needed to confirm the exact spelling of the residents' names for the insurance liability forms before we brought a $50,000 table up his elevators. The concierge hesitated. He told me that penthouse deliveries were supposed to be scheduled weeks in advance. I leaned over the desk, my face rigid with manufactured frustration. I told him that I was just the coordinator trying to fix a mistake, and that if he wanted to be the one to tell the penthouse residents their custom order was being sent back to the warehouse, he could make that call right now. That subtle threat worked. In luxury buildings, the staff are trained to fear displeasing the wealthiest tenants. He typed quickly on his sleek computer terminal and turned the monitor slightly toward me. He said he would read off the names, but I could not take any photographs. I told him I just needed to verify my manifest. I looked at the glowing screen. There it was at the very top of the directory. Penthouse Suite. The primary resident was listed as Colin Fletcher, but there was a second name right below his. Vanessa Croft. I stared at the name. Vanessa Croft. My chest tightened, but I kept my expression entirely neutral. I wrote the name down on my blank clipboard. I asked the concierge how long Miss Croft had been a resident. The concierge looked at me strangely and said that Mr. Fletcher and Miss Croft had purchased the penthouse together nearly 6 years ago. 6 years. Rachel had been dead for 8. For 6 of those years, Colin had been living here with another woman, while I deposited $55,000 into his account every single January. I thanked the concierge, picked up my clipboard, and walked back down the service corridor. I pushed through the heavy door and stepped back out into the freezing wind. I did not go back to my truck immediately. I walked to the park directly across the avenue. I stood under the bare branches of a massive oak tree and tilted my head back, staring up at the very top of the glass skyscraper. The penthouse level featured a massive wraparound balcony that overlooked the entire city skyline. I stood there shivering in the cold, waiting. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Finally, the tall glass doors of the balcony slid open. 2 figures stepped out into the crisp winter sunlight. Even from this distance, the contrast was staggering. Colin had taken off his cashmere sweater. He was now wearing a tailored dark suit jacket that fit him perfectly. A woman stepped out onto the balcony beside him. Vanessa Croft. She was tall, with long dark hair that blew in the wind. She was wearing a sleek silk dress and a thick white fur wrap draped over her shoulders. Colin was holding a dark green bottle with gold foil wrapped around the neck. He popped the cork. I could not hear the sound over the city traffic, but I saw the spray of champagne catch the sunlight. He poured the sparkling liquid into 2 crystal flutes. He handed one to Vanessa. They clinked their glasses together and laughed, leaning against the glass railing to admire the city they felt they owned. I watched them drink their expensive champagne, and the final pieces of the puzzle locked into place in my mind. The money I had been sending every year to feed and clothe my granddaughter was never meant to survive inflation. It was not meant to pay for specialized tutors or warm coats. It was funding a ghost life. It was paying for the lifestyle of a billionaire fantasy. The realization was like swallowing crushed glass. I thought about the dilapidated suburban house. I thought about the broken doorbell, the dead thermostat, and the completely empty living room. That house was nothing more than a prop. It was a miserable freezing cage where he kept Lily isolated from the world just so he could maintain the illusion of being a struggling single father. He used my dead daughter's child as a piece of collateral to extort money from a grieving grandfather. While Lily sat in a freezing room wearing clothes that did not fit her, Colin was pouring vintage champagne for his secret partner in a multi-million-dollar penthouse. He had completely detached himself from his child's suffering. He was siphoning every drop of wealth he could extract from me to feed his own vanity and greed. I turned away from the building and walked back to my truck. I took off the yellow vest and threw it onto the passenger seat. I started the engine and turned the heater on full blast. The cold inside the cab slowly retreated, but the ice in my veins remained. I was no longer an old man mourning the loss of his family. I was a man who had just discovered that his family was being systematically destroyed for profit. Colin thought he had engineered the perfect scam. He thought he could keep Lily hidden in the suburbs while he lived like a king in the sky. But he had made one fatal mistake. He had let me see the cracks in his performance. He had let Lily get just close enough to whisper the truth into my ear. I put the truck in gear and pulled away from the curb. I knew exactly what I had to do next. I had to play his game. I had to put on a mask of total ignorance and walk right back into his trap. But this time I would be the one holding the wire. 3 days after I stood on the cold pavement looking up at his penthouse, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was a text from Colin. The message was brief and lacked any warmth. He asked if I was available for dinner that evening at a chain steakhouse out on the highway near his decoy house. I stared at the glowing screen. For the past 8 years, he had only ever contacted me in January when the wire transfer was due. Reaching out twice in 1 week meant he was accelerating his timeline. He wanted something else. I typed back a simple yes. I walked to the bathroom mirror and looked at my own reflection. I had to practice the face of a gullible, grieving old man. I had to bury the hunter and resurrect the victim. It was the hardest thing I have ever had to do. I arrived at the restaurant 10 minutes early. The place smelled of stale fryer grease and cheap beer. The carpet was a faded maroon with dark, sticky patches. This was exactly the kind of place Colin used to reinforce his narrative of financial struggle. He wanted me to see him eating mediocre food in a depressing environment, so I would feel sorry for him. I slid into a vinyl booth in the back corner and waited. At exactly 7 o'clock, Colin walked through the double glass doors. He was not wearing the bespoke suit I had seen him wearing on the balcony. He was wearing faded jeans and a slightly wrinkled button-down shirt. He had dressed down for the performance. He slid into the booth opposite me and let out a long, exhausted sigh, rubbing his temples as if he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Thanks for meeting me, Stephen," he said. His voice carefully modulated to sound defeated. "Work has been completely overwhelming. I barely have time to breathe, let alone cook a decent meal." I forced a sympathetic smile. I told him I understood, and that being a single father was a heavy burden. The waitress came over and dropped 2 plastic menus on the table. Colin made a show of checking the prices. He ordered a basic burger and a tap water. I ordered a coffee. I kept my hands folded on the table to hide the fact that my fists were clenched so tight, my fingernails were cutting into my palms. I asked him how Lily was doing. I asked if she was feeling any warmer since my visit. Colin waved his hand dismissively. "She is fine," he said, taking a sip of his water. "But that is actually why I needed to see you. We have a serious problem, Stephen." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the sticky table. As he made the movement, the cuff of his wrinkled shirt slid back just a fraction of an inch. A flash of silver and sapphire caught the harsh fluorescent lighting of the restaurant. It was a luxury watch, a platinum Rolex. I knew enough about watches to know that model cost more than the truck I drove to get here. He quickly pulled his sleeve down, but the damage was done. He was sitting in a cheap steakhouse pretending to be destitute while wearing $40,000 on his wrist. My blood boiled. The urge to reach across the table and grab him by the throat was almost overpowering. But I remembered Lily shivering in that house. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat and leaned in, mirroring his serious expression. "What kind of problem?" I asked, keeping my voice laced with appropriate grandfatherly concern. Colin lowered his voice, looking around as if sharing a painful secret. "It is her schoolwork," he said, shaking his head sadly. "The teachers called me in for an emergency meeting yesterday. Lily is falling severely behind. They are talking about holding her back a grade. They suspect she has severe learning disabilities. Dyslexia may be something worse. The public school system cannot accommodate her needs. They told me if I do not get her into a specialized intensive tutoring program, immediately her cognitive development will be permanently stunted." The lie was so grotesque it took my breath away. He was weaponizing the child he was actively neglecting. He was inventing medical and psychological defects to extract more capital. I thought about the dark circles under Lily's eyes. She was not failing because of a learning disability. She was failing because she was starving and freezing and completely abandoned by the man sitting across from me. I widened my eyes, playing the part of the horrified elder. I asked him what we needed to do to fix it. I asked him how much the specialized program would cost. Colin looked down at the table, pretending to be ashamed. "The specialized academy is incredibly expensive, Stephen. They require a dedicated behavioral therapist and custom curriculum software. With the private school tuition, it pushes the annual cost to $80,000. I have tried to secure a second mortgage on the house, but the bank rejected me. I am out of options. I do not know how I am going to save her. $80,000. He was asking for a $25,000 raise to fund his penthouse lifestyle. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and pleading. He was an incredibly talented actor. If I had not seen Vanessa Croft drinking champagne on that balcony, I would have written the check right there in the booth. I let a heavy silence hang between us. I looked at the plastic salt shaker. I looked at the faded menu. Then I looked back at Colin. I let out a long, trembling breath, acting as if I was making a massive personal sacrifice. "I will do it," I said softly. "I will liquidate one of my remaining mutual funds and increase the annual transfer to $80,000. Lily is my blood. I will not let her fall behind." Colin's shoulders dropped in exaggerated relief. He reached across the table and squeezed my arm. "Thank you, Stephen," he whispered. "You have no idea what this means for her. I promise I will pay you back someday when I get on my feet." I smiled at him, a cold, dead smile that he mistook for affection. I pulled my arm away gently. "There is just one thing, Colin," I said, my tone shifting slightly to something more businesslike. "My accountant has been hounding me about these large transfers. The IRS is getting strict about untaxed family gifts. If I am going to pull another $25,000 out of my investments, I need to categorize it properly as a direct medical and educational expense to avoid a massive penalty. Colin frowned slightly, the first sign of genuine emotion cracking his facade. What does that mean exactly? It just means I need a paper trail, I explained, keeping my voice light and breezy. Before I authorize the $80,000, I need you to send me the official medical diagnoses from the school psychologist and the detailed invoices from this new specialized tutoring program. Just basic billing documents with letterheads, so my accountant can file them with my returns. It is just a formality to keep the government off my back. Colin relaxed. The slight panic in his eyes vanished, replaced by his usual supreme arrogance. He thought I was just an old man worried about a tax audit. He thought he could easily whip up some fake documents on his laptop. He had been forging his reality for 8 years. He had no reason to believe a few fake invoices would trip him up now. Of course, Stephen, he said, waving his hand dismissively. I will have the school and the clinic email me the official invoices and the diagnostic reports by tomorrow morning. I will forward them straight to you, whatever you need for your taxes. Perfect, I said, picking up my coffee cup. The moment I have those documents, the money will be released. The waitress brought his burger. He ate it with the enthusiasm of a man who had just won the lottery. He talked about the weather. He talked about sports. He played the part of the relieved father to absolute perfection. As he devoured the greasy meal, I noticed the subtle tells of his deception. The way he chewed with absolute confidence. The way he did not ask a single question about Rachel's memory or how I was coping with the anniversary of her death. He was entirely consumed by his own victory. He wiped his mouth with a paper napkin, leaving a smear of grease on the cheap paper. I imagined Vanessa Croft waiting for him in the sky, probably wondering why he was late for their real dinner. I imagined him laughing with her later tonight, telling her how easily he manipulated the old fool. I asked for the check. I paid for his burger with exact change. We walked out into the freezing parking lot together. He wrapped his arms around himself, shivering violently, playing the part of the cold, tired worker, heading back to his freezing house. He thanked me again, his breath pluming in the air. I told him to just get me those documents. He promised he would. He got into his hybrid decoy car and drove away toward the suburbs. I knew he would circle the block, make sure I was gone, and then head straight back to the biometric scanner downtown. I got into my truck. I did not follow him this time. I did not need to. I pulled out my phone and found the number for Oliver Stanton. The trap was set. Now I needed a monster to help me spring it. The morning after my dinner with Colin, the promised documents arrived in my email inbox. They looked incredibly professional. There was a detailed diagnostic report from a pediatric behavioral clinic and 3 heavily itemized invoices from a specialized tutoring academy. I printed every single page. I did not call my regular accountant, who handled my standard retirement taxes. I drove straight into the financial district to a high-security building that housed the offices of Oliver Stanton. Oliver was not a family lawyer who handled friendly mediations or gentle estate planning. He was a forensic accountant and a corporate attorney who specialized in tearing apart offshore tax havens and destroying financial criminals. We had history together. 8 years ago, he was just a junior associate assigned to help me organize the basic paperwork after my daughter's funeral. He had been quiet and respectful back then, diligently sorting through hospital bills. Now he was a senior partner in the firm, known throughout the city for his absolute ruthlessness. I sat in his massive glass-walled office overlooking the busy downtown streets. The room was perfectly sterile and entirely intimidating. There were no family photos on his desk. There was only a sleek dual-monitor computer setup and stacks of heavily redacted legal briefs. Oliver walked in carrying 2 cups of black coffee. He wore a charcoal suit that looked like armor. He did not offer empty condolences or engage in polite small talk. He knew I would not be sitting in his office unless a disaster had occurred. I took a sip of the bitter coffee and slid the manila folder across the polished glass desk. I told him I needed him to quietly verify the authenticity of the enclosed invoices. I explained that my son-in-law was requesting an additional $25,000 on top of my annual $55,000 wire transfer to pay for these specialized educational and medical services. Oliver opened the folder. He did not say a word. He just adjusted his glasses and began reading the documents line by line. I watched his eyes scan the pediatric behavioral report. Then he moved to the billing invoices from the tutoring academy. He held one of the pages up to the natural light streaming through the window, studying the formatting of the letterhead and the alignment of the text. His expression remained completely blank, but his fingers tapped a slow, rhythmic beat against the edge of his massive desk. He dropped the paper back into the folder. He told me the formatting was incredibly sophisticated, but the routing numbers at the bottom of the invoice were structured like commercial holding accounts, not educational institutions. Oliver turned to his computer and quickly typed the tax identification numbers listed on the Tutoring Academy invoice into his forensic financial database. I sat in total silence listening to the rapid clicking of his keyboard. The tension in the room was suffocating. I knew Colin was lying about the tutoring because I had seen his penthouse life, but I needed to know exactly how he was moving the stolen money. Oliver hit the enter key and waited for the search results to populate on his screen. A moment later, a series of complex corporate structures appeared. He swiveled his monitor slightly so I could see the cascading lines of data. He explained that the Tutoring Academy did not exist anywhere in the state registry. The tax identification number belonged to a dormant shell company registered in Delaware. He ran the pediatric clinic next. The result was exactly the same. The clinic was a ghost entity managed by a third-party registered agent. Colin had not just printed fake documents on his home computer. He had set up dummy corporations to launder my money so it would look perfectly legitimate to any standard tax auditor. He was a professional parasite operating with terrifying efficiency. Oliver leaned back in his leather chair and looked at me. He said this level of financial obfuscation was not something a desperate single father sets up overnight. He said this was a long-term calculated operation designed to extract maximum wealth while hiding the paper trail. Oliver looked down at the folder again, and a dark shadow crossed his face. He asked me how long I had been sending Colin $55,000 a year. I told him I started immediately after Rachel died because the life insurance policy had been voided due to a missed signature on a renewal form. Oliver stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. He stared at me with a look of absolute disbelief. He slowly opened a secure locked drawer in his desk and pulled out a small encrypted hard drive. He plugged it into his computer tower. He told me that when he was a junior associate, he had meticulously archived every single digital file related to Rachel's estate before the senior partners closed the account. He said he remembered Rachel's file vividly because she was one of the most organized actuaries he had ever seen in his entire career. He told me it made absolutely no sense that a woman who assessed risk for a living would let $1 million policy lapse over a single piece of paper. He typed a complex password into his security system and opened a folder dated 8 years ago. My heart began to pound against my ribs as I watched him navigate through the old digital archives. He clicked on a subfolder labeled Insurance Disbursements. He opened a scanned document and enlarged it on the screen. The room felt suddenly devoid of oxygen. Oliver pointed to the screen, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He told me the insurance policy had never been voided. The insurance company had paid out in full exactly 3 weeks after Rachel's death. The payout was $1.2 million. I felt the blood drain entirely from my face. I gripped the leather arms of my chair, trying to anchor myself to reality. I asked him how that was possible. I asked him how Colin could access that money without my knowledge, since I was explicitly listed as the secondary beneficiary and the executor of the estate. Oliver scrolled down to the second page of the digital document. It was a legal waiver permanently forfeiting my rights to the insurance money and authorizing the immediate transfer of the entire $1.2 million into a private offshore trust managed solely by Colin. At the bottom of the page, in black ink, was my signature. I stared at the screen. I stared at the graceful loops of my own handwriting. It was a perfect, flawless forgery. Colin had sat in my kitchen weeping into his hands, begging me to save his daughter from bankruptcy, while over $1 million of my daughter's blood money was quietly being wired to an island account. He had stolen her legacy and then used my grief to extort me for nearly $500,000 more over the next 8 years. Oliver printed the forged waiver and laid it on the desk directly next to the fake tutoring invoices. The timeline was completely clear now. Colin used the $1 million to buy his luxury penthouse and fund his secret life with the other woman. He used my annual wire transfers to pay for his designer clothes, his expensive cars, and his high-end restaurant dinners. And he left Lily shivering in a broken-down house to maintain the illusion of poverty. Oliver looked at me with cold, predatory eyes. He told me we were no longer dealing with simple tax fraud. We were dealing with massive wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny. He said if we took this to the police right now, they would arrest Colin, but the offshore money would disappear instantly, and the ensuing custody battle for Lily could take years. Colin would drag it out, using the stolen money to hire aggressive defense attorneys. I told Oliver that was completely unacceptable. I told him Lily was supposed to be sent to a cheap boarding school out of state in less than 48 hours. If she got on that bus, I might never see her again. I needed a weapon that would destroy Colin completely and sever his parental rights instantly without giving him a single chance to fight back. Oliver smiled a tight, ruthless smile. He gathered the fake invoices and the forged waiver. He told me that financial criminals always have one fatal weakness. Their weakness is that they can never resist a significantly larger payout. He told me we were going to build a legal trap so incredibly lucrative that Colin would willingly walk into it and lock the door behind himself. I walked out of the towering glass building in the financial district, and the freezing winter air hit my face like a sheet of ice. The sheer magnitude of what Oliver had just shown me was a physical weight pressing down on my chest. $1 million stolen. A perfectly forged signature on a legal waiver. A secret, luxurious life built entirely on the bones of my dead daughter. I unlocked my truck and climbed inside, but I did not start the engine immediately. I sat in the cold silence of the cab, staring out at the rushing city traffic. For 8 years, I had thought I was protecting my only grandchild from the harsh realities of poverty. Now I knew I was funding a monster who was actively keeping her trapped in a miserable, freezing existence. My mind raced with the meticulous, slow-burn strategies Oliver and I had just discussed. We were going to build an airtight case of grand larceny and wire fraud. We were going to blindside him in court and systematically dismantle his life. I felt a grim sense of control returning to me. But that illusion of control lasted exactly 3 minutes. The Bluetooth display on my dashboard suddenly flashed bright blue. My phone was ringing. The caller identification displayed Colin's name. I took a deep breath, forcing my heart rate to slow down. I had to maintain the mask of the gullible, grieving grandfather. I pressed the button on the steering wheel to accept the call. I cleared my throat and answered with a tone of mild curiosity. Colin spoke, and his voice was entirely different from the exhausted, defeated man I had met at the cheap steakhouse the night before. He sounded energized. He was practically vibrating with excitement. He told me he had wonderful news. He said he had taken my advice to heart and stayed up all night calling every specialized educational facility in the country. He claimed he had found the absolute perfect solution for Lily's severe learning disabilities. I asked him to explain. I kept my voice perfectly even, though a cold knot of dread was already forming in my stomach. He told me he had secured a spot for Lily at an immersive cognitive development center. He used a lot of expensive-sounding buzzwords. He talked about dedicated behavioral integration and structured environmental therapy. Then I asked him where this miracle school was located. I expected him to name one of the high-end private academies in the wealthy suburbs north of the city. Instead, he named a small, remote town in rural Idaho. I did the math in my head instantly. Idaho was 3 states away. It was a completely isolated region surrounded by mountains and wilderness. I asked him why he was sending her so far from home. His tone shifted, becoming slightly defensive, but masked with fake parental concern. He told me it was a strict year-round residential program. There were no summer breaks. There were no weekend visits. He explained that the facility requires a minimum 12-month blackout period for new students. That meant no phone calls and no holiday visits home for an entire year. He claimed it was standard protocol to ensure the children were fully integrated into the therapeutic environment without any emotional distractions from their families. He was not sending her to a school. He was exiling her. He was paying a discount facility to make his only liability disappear permanently. I asked him about the cost. He laughed a light, arrogant laugh. He said the $80,000 I promised to transfer would cover the first full year of tuition and board perfectly. He said he had already signed the preliminary enrollment forms electronically. Then he delivered the final crushing blow. He told me that because of her supposedly severe needs, the academy required immediate placement. He said he had arranged for a specialized private adolescent transport service to pick her up from the house early Thursday morning. I looked at the digital clock on my dashboard. It was Tuesday afternoon. Thursday morning was less than 48 hours away. The implications crashed over me like a collapsing building. If he got her across state lines, the legal jurisdiction would change entirely. She would be locked away in a cheap remote holding facility while he pocketed the massive remainder of my $80,000 to pay for his penthouse lifestyle with Vanessa Croft. Lily would become a ghost lost in a system designed to keep difficult children out of sight. I would never be able to see her again. I forced my voice to convey nothing but deep relief and profound gratitude. I told him I was incredibly proud of him for taking such swift and decisive action. I told him he was a truly dedicated father, making a massive sacrifice for his child. Every single word tasted like battery acid in my mouth. I assured him the funds would be processed by my bank tomorrow. He thanked me profusely, his voice dripping with triumphant greed, and then he hung up. I immediately threw the truck into gear and pulled out into the traffic. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so hard, my knuckles ached. The methodical, careful, legal plan Oliver and I were building was completely useless now. We did not have weeks to subpoena offshore bank records. We did not have months to build an airtight wire fraud case. We had less than 2 days. I dialed Oliver's direct office line through the truck speakers. He answered on the first ring. I did not bother with pleasantries. I repeated the entire conversation to him word for word. I told him about the facility in Idaho. I told him about the 12-month isolation protocol. And I told him about the private transport van arriving in 48 hours. The line was completely silent for a long moment as Oliver processed the sudden violent compression of our timeline. When he finally spoke, his voice was completely stripped of its usual professional detachment. He sounded genuinely alarmed. Oliver told me the legal reality was much worse than I even realized. He explained that if Colin successfully established Lily's residency in Idaho, any emergency custody petition I tried to file in our home state would be thrown out immediately. We would be dragged into a horrific jurisdictional dispute that could take years to resolve. Colin would have total absolute control over her location, and he would use my stolen money to hire lawyers to keep me away. I asked Oliver how we stopped the transport van. I asked him if the forged insurance documents were enough to get Colin arrested right now. Oliver gave me a grim answer. He said financial crimes take time to process. Getting a warrant for offshore wire fraud requires federal judges and complex jurisdiction approvals. It would take at least a week just to get a detective assigned to the forgery. But child endangerment is entirely different. Child endangerment demands immediate catastrophic police intervention. Oliver told me that if we wanted to stop that transport van from leaving the driveway on Thursday morning, we needed undeniable visual proof that Colin was actively neglecting her right now. We needed a smoking gun so severe that it would force local law enforcement and child protective services to raid the house and strip his parental rights on the spot. I looked over at the passenger seat of my truck. In the center console, underneath a stack of old toll receipts, I had a spare brass key. Colin had given it to me 6 years ago, claiming it was for extreme emergencies only. I had never used it because he always insisted on being present whenever I visited. I knew Colin was currently downtown in his luxury high-rise celebrating his massive incoming payday with his secret partner. The freezing decoy house in the suburbs was sitting completely empty right now except for a terrified 10-year-old girl. I told Oliver I was going into the house today. I told him I was going to find the proof we needed to destroy Colin before the sun came up on Thursday. Oliver warned me about the severe legal consequences of breaking and entering, but I cut him off mid-sentence. I told him there were no rules anymore. There was only a grandfather protecting his blood. I pressed my foot down hard on the accelerator, heading straight for the suburbs. I drove back to the decaying suburban neighborhood with a singular dark purpose burning in my chest. The afternoon sun was already beginning to dip behind the bare winter trees, casting long, jagged shadows across the cracked pavement. I parked my heavy truck 2 streets over, hiding it behind a row of overgrown hedges. I had to assume Colin was paranoid enough to have some sort of exterior motion sensor linked to his smartphone. I walked through the overgrown back alley, stepping carefully over broken glass and discarded trash. My heavy boots made almost no sound on the frozen dirt. I reached the back gate of his property and slipped the rusted latch. The backyard was a complete wasteland of dead brown grass and rotting patio furniture. It looked like a house that had been abandoned for years. I approached the back door. My hands were completely steady as I reached into my heavy wool coat pocket and pulled out the brass key he had given me 6 years ago. He had installed a basic security keypad near the doorframe. I remembered him bragging about it once, claiming it was top of the line to keep Lily safe. But I had spent 40 years in construction management, and I knew exactly what brand it was. It was a cheap off-the-shelf system you buy at a discount hardware store. I slid the brass key into the deadbolt and turned it. The heavy lock clicked open. I pushed the door inward, and the keypad immediately began to emit a high-pitched warning tone. I had exactly 30 seconds before it triggered an automated police dispatch. I did not panic. I knew Colin was incredibly cheap when it came to everything outside his own personal luxury. I reached under the cheap plastic housing of the keypad and simply pulled the battery compartment loose with my bare hands. The beeping died instantly. The house fell into an absolute suffocating silence. I stepped into the kitchen, and the freezing indoor air hit me again. It smelled like dust and damp, rotting wood. I walked over to the refrigerator. I opened the door expecting to see meager rations or cheap processed food. Instead, I found a thick, heavy-duty steel padlock, secured through two custom-drilled metal brackets on the door and the frame. He had literally locked the food away from a 10-year-old child. My stomach turned violently. I peered through the small gap in the rubber magnetic seal. There was nothing inside but a few bottles of filtered water and some expired generic condiments. I moved to the dry pantry. The wooden door was also padlocked shut. He was intentionally starving her, regulating her caloric intake so he did not have to spend a single dime of his stolen millions on groceries for his own daughter. I left the kitchen and walked down the dark, narrow hallway toward the bedrooms. I pushed open the door to Lily's room. The temperature dropped even further. It felt like walking into a meat locker. I looked at the window. The thin glass was single pane and completely frosted over from the inside. There were no thermal curtains, just a cheap plastic blind pulled tight to hide the misery from the street. Her bed was a small, stained mattress resting directly on the floorboards, covered with a single thin gray blanket. There were no toys. There were no colorful books. There were no signs of childhood joy anywhere. It looked like a prison cell designed for maximum psychological punishment. I touched the mattress. It was ice cold. I thought about the plush white imported carpet and the roaring gas fireplace in his downtown penthouse. I thought about Vanessa Croft wearing a thick fur wrap while sipping vintage champagne on a balcony funded by my daughter's death. I left her freezing room and moved further down the hall to the master bedroom, which Colin had converted into his supposed home office. The door was locked, but a simple twist of a flathead screwdriver I brought from my truck popped the cheap mechanism. I stepped inside. The room was surprisingly warm. He had installed a massive industrial space heater in the corner, but he had positioned it so the heat only warmed the area directly around a large, expensive leather chair. On the polished wooden desk sat a high-end computer monitor and a locked metal server box. I walked over to the desk and noticed a small black dome mounted in the upper corner of the ceiling. It was a digital security camera. I quickly checked the hallway outside the office and found another camera angled directly at Lily's bedroom door. They were not pointing outside to stop dangerous intruders. They were pointing inside to monitor a captive child. I sat down in the leather chair and moved the computer mouse. The large screen woke up, illuminating the dark room. It requested an administrator password. I thought about the arrogance of financial criminals. They always believe they are the smartest people in the room, but they are ultimately creatures of immense ego and vanity. I typed the name of his exclusive downtown street, followed by the year he bought the luxury penthouse. Access denied. I paused for a second, and then typed Vanessa Croft's last name followed by the word penthouse. The screen unlocked instantly. The digital desktop was cluttered with financial folders, but one specific icon caught my eye immediately. It was labeled Home Monitoring Archive. I double-clicked the folder and opened the video management software. It contained hundreds of indexed video files organized by date and timestamps. I clicked on a large file from last weekend. The high-definition video feed opened, showing the dark hallway. A digital timestamp in the bottom corner read, Friday evening at 6 o'clock. The silent footage showed Colin walking out of the master bedroom wearing his expensive tailored winter coat. He paused in front of Lily's door, holding a small white plastic grocery bag. He dropped the bag on the floor outside her room and walked straight out the front door, locking the deadbolt behind him. I fast-forwarded the video. For 48 straight hours, the house remained completely empty. No one came to check on her, no one left. The only movement was Lily briefly opening her door, shivering violently in her oversized sweatshirt, taking the small plastic bag and retreating back into the freezing darkness. I opened another file from 2 weeks ago. The exact same horrific pattern played out on the screen. He was leaving her entirely alone in this freezing house with nothing but a single bag of cheap snacks from Friday night until Sunday evening, while he lived with his mistress downtown. This was the exact, undeniable proof Oliver needed. This was not just complex financial neglect. This was felony child endangerment. This was a direct, verifiable threat to her physical survival. Local law enforcement could not ignore this footage. A family court judge would not wait weeks to process offshore bank records when presented with high-definition video evidence of a child abandoned for days in a freezing home. I pulled a heavy-duty, high-capacity flash drive from my coat pocket. I plugged it into the port on the front of the metal server box. I highlighted the entire surveillance archive folder spanning the last 6 months. I dragged the files onto my drive and hit copy. A progress bar appeared on the screen estimating 5 minutes to completion. I sat in the silent, warm office watching the green bar slowly fill across the monitor. Every single byte of data transferring onto that small plastic drive was another nail in Colin's coffin. He thought he had outsmarted everyone. He thought he could ship her to a remote facility in Idaho and erase his only liability forever while keeping my $80,000. But he had left his own digital confession sitting right here on a desk. The file transfer reached 100%. A small notification popped up confirming the massive video files were successfully copied. I safely ejected the flash drive and slipped it deep into my inside chest pocket, keeping it close to my heart. I closed the video software and locked the computer screen, returning the digital workspace to the exact state I found it in. I stood up and walked out of the office, pulling the wooden door shut behind me until the broken lock clicked back into place. I walked down the dark hallway one last time, pausing briefly outside Lily's freezing bedroom. I promised her silently that she would never have to sleep on that ice-cold mattress again. I walked out the back door, reattached the keypad battery, and locked the deadbolt. As I walked back down the dirt alley toward my truck, the freezing wind hit my face, but I did not feel the cold at all. I felt a burning, undeniable power surging through my veins. I finally had the smoking gun. I had the ultimate weapon to sever his parental rights instantly and completely destroy the fake billionaire world he had built. I drove away from the decaying suburbs with the heavy-duty flash drive resting against my chest like a loaded weapon. The digital evidence of my granddaughter's torment was safely secured in my pocket. But my work for the night was not finished. While I was downloading the video files from Colin's computer, I had noticed a digital invitation left open on his secondary monitor. It was a formal announcement for an exclusive engagement soiree hosted by Colin Fletcher and Vanessa Croft. The date and time were listed for that exact evening at 8 o'clock in the downtown penthouse. He was throwing himself a massive celebration to commemorate his upcoming wedding and his incoming $80,000 payday. I looked at the dashboard clock. It was just past 7:30. I had enough time to make an appearance. I navigated the truck back onto the interstate, heading straight for the glowing skyline of the financial district. I did not want to confront him in front of his wealthy friends. I did not want to scream or throw punches. I wanted to do something much more damaging. I wanted to infect his perfect reality with a virus of pure paranoia. I parked my truck in a dark underground garage 2 blocks away from the glass skyscraper. I took a moment to adjust my clothing. I was wearing my dark wool winter coat over a crisp button-down shirt and dark trousers. It was not a bespoke tuxedo, but it was formal enough to blend into the shadows of a crowded room. I walked the 2 blocks through the biting winter wind and approached the service entrance of the building. The evening staff was entirely focused on the massive influx of catering crews and florists rushing into the lobby. I slipped through the side door unnoticed, falling into step behind a line of waiters carrying massive silver trays of fresh oysters and crystal champagne flutes. I kept my head down and my expression entirely blank, acting like a senior event coordinator supervising the chaotic delivery process. We piled into the oversized stainless steel freight elevator. I stood in the back corner as the numbers above the door climbed rapidly toward the penthouse level. The heavy metal doors slid open, and the noise of the party hit me like a physical wave. The sheer scale of the wealth on display was instantly nauseating. The freight elevator opened directly into a massive catering staging area, just off the main living space. I stepped out of the service corridor and walked smoothly into the primary reception room. It was not an apartment. It was a palace suspended in the clouds. The floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the entire city. The floors were polished white marble that reflected the soft glow of hundreds of floating candles. A live string quartet was playing a classical arrangement in the corner. I walked slowly along the perimeter of the room, keeping my back close to the wall, observing the world my dead daughter's life insurance had purchased. There were at least 100 guests mingling in the massive space. They were the absolute elite of the city. Men in tailored silk suits and women wearing diamonds that caught the light with every movement. I looked at the massive ice sculpture dominating the center of the room. I looked at the towering floral arrangements of rare imported orchids that lined the balcony doors. I did a rough calculation in my head based on my years of managing large corporate events. The catering, the live music, the premium alcohol, and the decorations alone cost an absolute fortune. This single party cost easily $55,000. It was the exact amount I had wired to him last January. He was literally drinking the money that was supposed to keep his daughter warm. While Lily sat shivering in the dark, eating cheap expired snacks, he was feeding imported caviar to strangers. I continued my slow, deliberate pacing around the edge of the room. No one paid any attention to me. To them, I was just an older gentleman, perhaps an uncle or a retired business partner enjoying the music. Then I spotted her. Vanessa Croft was standing near the grand piano. She looked stunning in a floor-length emerald gown, her dark hair styled perfectly. She was laughing brightly, resting her hand elegantly on the arm of a wealthy older man. She radiated the absolute confidence of a woman who believes her future is entirely secure. She had no idea that her entire existence was funded by the systemic torture of a 10-year-old girl. Or perhaps she did know and simply did not care. It did not matter. Her world was about to end just as abruptly as Colin's. I turned my gaze away from the bride-to-be and scanned the center of the room. There he was. Colin was holding court near the massive glass balcony doors. He looked like a king, completely untouched by consequence. He was wearing a dark velvet dinner jacket that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. His platinum luxury watch caught the ambient light as he gestured expansively, telling a story to a circle of attentive listeners. He held a crystal tumbler of amber liquid in his right hand. He was smiling a wide, genuine smile of total victory. He thought he had outsmarted everyone. He thought he was 48 hours away from banishing Lily to a frozen wasteland and securing an $80,000 annual income for the rest of his life. I stepped away from the wall and moved slightly deeper into the room. I positioned myself directly in his line of sight, but kept a safe distance of about 40 feet between us. I stood perfectly still. The crowd shifted and parted naturally around me as people moved toward the bar. I waited. The string quartet reached a crescendo. Colin tossed his head back, laughing at a joke someone in his circle had just made. As his laughter subsided, his eyes naturally swept across the room, surveying his kingdom. His gaze washed over the crowd and then stopped. His eyes locked directly onto mine. The physical reaction was instantaneous and violently, completely involuntary. The arrogant smile vanished from his face as if it had been wiped away by a coarse, heavy cloth. All the color drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His eyes widened in absolute, unadulterated terror. He could not process what he was seeing. My presence in his penthouse was an absolute impossibility. I was supposed to be the naive old fool sitting in my quiet house, completely ignorant of his true life. Seeing me standing in the middle of his secret world shattered his reality into a million jagged pieces. His hand began to tremble. It was a violent, uncontrollable shake. The crystal tumbler slipped from his fingers. It hit the marble floor with a sharp, loud crash. The heavy glass shattered, sending expensive amber liquor and ice cubes sliding across the pristine white floor. The sound was incredibly loud over the classical music. The small circle of guests around him jumped back in surprise, looking at him with confused expressions. Vanessa turned her head sharply from across the room, hearing the breaking glass. Colin did not look down at the mess. He did not apologize to his guests. He could not break eye contact with me. He was completely paralyzed, breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his velvet jacket. His mind was desperately trying to calculate how I got there, how much I knew, and what I was going to do next. I did not walk toward him. I did not say a single word. I simply stood there looking at him with eyes as cold and dead as the winter wind outside. A waiter walked past me carrying a silver tray of fresh champagne flutes. I slowly reached out and took a glass by the delicate crystal stem. I held Colin's terrified gaze. I lifted the glass, raising it in a slow, deliberate, silent toast. I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who has already dug the grave and is just waiting for the body to fall. I took a slow sip of the cold champagne. Then I turned around and walked away. I did not run. I walked with steady, measured steps, blending right back into the crowd of wealthy strangers. I headed straight for the service corridor, pushing through the heavy swinging doors before anyone could think to stop me. I stepped back into the steel freight elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor. As the elevator descended, I felt a deep, profound satisfaction settling in my bones. I had not laid a single finger on him, but I had completely destroyed his mind. He would not sleep tonight. He would not be able to celebrate his engagement. He would spend the next several hours completely consumed by paranoia, terrified that I was going to call the police or ruin his reputation. His false victory was over. The psychological torture had begun, and he had no idea that the real trap was waiting for him tomorrow morning. I walked out of the building and stepped into the freezing night air, ready to finish what he started. The sun rose on Wednesday morning, painting the frost on my kitchen window a pale, dead gray. I sat at my wooden table staring at the heavy-duty flash drive resting next to my coffee cup. The digital evidence of his cruelty was safe, but it was not enough to just have the weapon. I needed to bring the target into the firing line. I thought about the look of absolute terror on Colin's face the night before. I knew exactly how he had spent his night. He had not slept. He had paced the marble floors of his penthouse, sweating, trying to figure out why I was at his party and what I was planning to do. His mind was fractured by paranoia. That made him incredibly dangerous, but it also made him vulnerable. A panicked man will grab any lifeline you throw at him without checking to see if it is tied to an anvil. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and placed it on the table. It was time to execute the final phase of the setup. I needed to transform his fear of discovery into an overwhelming, blinding greed. I closed my eyes and took several deep breaths, practicing the physical sensations of pure terror. I thought about the moment I found out Rachel was dying. I let that old raw panic flood back into my chest until my heart was racing and my hands began to tremble. I forced a dry rasp into my throat. When I felt completely broken, I opened my eyes and dialed his number. He answered on the second ring. His voice was sharp, defensive, and laced with barely suppressed hostility. He demanded to know what I was doing at his building last night. He was trying to establish dominance, trying to intimidate me into backing down. I did not let him finish his threat. I interrupted him with a violent, wet cough. I hacked into the receiver, making my breath sound ragged and shallow. I ignored his question completely and spoke in a weak, trembling whisper. I told him I was so sorry for crashing the party. I told him I had received a call from my oncologist yesterday afternoon, and I was completely out of my mind with shock. I said I had wandered downtown looking for him because I did not know what else to do, but when I saw all those wealthy people, I got confused and left. I fed him the perfect excuse. I gave him a reason for my presence that completely erased his paranoia and replaced it with a sudden, intense curiosity. The hostility in his voice vanished instantly. He asked me what the oncologist said, trying to sound like a concerned son-in-law. I let out a long, pathetic sob. I told him it was stage 4 pancreatic cancer. I told him it had metastasized to my liver, and the doctors gave me less than 3 months to live. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. He was calculating how this sudden death sentence would affect his $80,000 annual payout. I did not give him time to worry about losing his income. I dropped the real bait directly into his lap. I told him I was terrified, not of dying, but of what would happen to my estate. I told him I had lived a very frugal life because I was quietly amassing generational wealth for Lily. I let my voice drop to a conspiratorial whisper. I told him my total liquid assets, the mutual funds, the untouched retirement accounts, and the real estate portfolio amounted to just over $4 million. I heard him gasp. It was a sharp, involuntary intake of air. $4 million. To a man who had spent the last 8 years stealing pennies to build a fake billionaire lifestyle, $4 million was the ultimate prize. It was enough money to actually become the man he was pretending to be. I kept pushing, leaning into the panic. I told him the hospital wanted to start aggressive, debilitating chemotherapy by Friday. I said I was terrified of going into hospice and having my entire estate locked up in probate court for years, while the state drained it with taxes and legal fees. I told him Lily could not wait years for that money. I told him I needed to bypass the courts entirely and establish an irrevocable joint trust immediately. I said I wanted to make him the primary co-trustee, giving him absolute legal control over the $4 million the moment I became incapacitated. He was practically hyperventilating on the other end of the line. His voice was shaking, but this time it was not from fear. It was from pure, unadulterated greed. He told me I was making the right decision. He praised my foresight. He told me he would manage the money perfectly and make sure Lily had everything she ever needed. It took every ounce of self-control I possessed not to scream at him through the phone. Instead, I thanked him, playing the role of the relieved, dying man. Then I set the terms of the trap. I told him my attorney, Oliver Stanton, had rushed the paperwork overnight. I said the trust documents were ready to be signed, but because of the size of the estate and my declining medical condition, the lawyer insisted that both trustees sign the documents in person to prevent any future legal challenges. I told him he needed to be at Oliver's office downtown at exactly 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Colin hesitated. The trap hit a snag. He reminded me that the private transport van was scheduled to pick Lily up tomorrow morning to take her to the facility in Idaho. He said he had to be at the house to sign the custody transfer forms for the drivers. He asked if we could push the legal meeting to the afternoon. I tightened the noose. I made my voice sound frantic and entirely uncompromising. I told him Oliver was flying out of the country for a corporate trial at noon, and if the trust was not signed by 10 in the morning, the $4 million would remain in my sole name. I told him if anything happened to me during the chemo, the state would appoint a public trustee to manage the money until Lily turned 21. I gave him a direct, agonizing choice. He could stay home and get rid of his daughter, or he could come to the office and become a multimillionaire. The silence lasted only 3 seconds. Greed is a highly predictable emotion. It always devours every other priority. Colin told me not to worry. He said he would call the transport company right now and cancel the van. He said he would delay Lily's enrollment by a few days so he could prioritize my peace of mind. He promised he would be at Oliver's office at 9 o'clock sharp. He told me I was doing a wonderful thing for the family. He said Rachel would be so proud of me. Hearing him use my dead daughter's name to secure his own wealth made my vision go entirely dark. I told him I would see him tomorrow, and I disconnected the call. I put the phone down on the wooden table. The house was completely silent. I looked out the frost-covered window, feeling the adrenaline slowly recede, leaving behind a cold, absolute clarity. I had done it. I had stopped the transport van. Lily was not going to be shipped to a frozen isolation facility in Idaho. She was safe for one more day. Colin thought he had just won the lottery. He thought his panicked night had magically transformed into the greatest financial victory of his life. He was probably pouring himself a glass of that expensive champagne right now, celebrating his incredible luck. He had completely blinded himself to the reality of the situation. He was so eager to get his hands on the $4 million that he did not realize he had just agreed to walk directly into a high-security legal firm to sign documents he had not even read. The Trojan horse was inside his gates. The prey had gleefully stepped into the cage and locked the door behind himself. Now all I had to do was wait for the sun to come up and hand the executioner his axe. I arrived at the massive glass building downtown exactly at 8:30 in the morning. The winter sun was bright, but completely devoid of warmth, reflecting harshly off the steel towers of the financial district. I took the private, secure elevator up to the top floor, where Oliver Stanton commanded his legal empire. The receptionist did not ask me to wait. She led me immediately down a long, silent hallway and into the primary boardroom. It was a terrifying room designed specifically to make opposing counsel sweat and surrender. The walls were paneled in dark acoustic wood that absorbed all sound. A massive slab of polished black marble served as the conference table, dominating the center of the room. Oliver was already there waiting for me. He wore a dark navy suit that looked like tailored armor. He looked like a predator resting calmly in the reeds. He had arranged 2 towering stacks of legal documents in front of a heavy leather guest chair. A single expensive fountain pen rested perfectly parallel to the white paper. We did not speak a single word to each other. We both knew exactly what was about to happen, and the gravity of the morning required no small talk. I walked over to the chair opposite the empty seat and sat down. I began to physically prepare my body for the performance of a lifetime. I hunched my shoulders forward, letting my chest sink inward. I forced my breathing to become shallow and irregular. I practiced a weak, rattling cough until my throat felt genuinely raw. I let my hands tremble slightly as I rested them on the cold marble. I was completely ready. At exactly 1 minute to 9 o'clock, the heavy wooden doors swung open. Colin walked into the room. He was wearing a dark, conservative suit, clearly trying to look like a man preparing for a tragic hospital visit, instead of a man preparing for a massive payday. He walked quickly toward me and placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. His touch made my skin crawl with disgust, but I endured it without flinching. He leaned down and asked me how I was feeling. his voice dripping with thick, fabricated concern. I let out a weak, wet cough and told him I was just holding on for Lily's sake. He nodded solemnly, but his eyes were darting rapidly toward the massive stack of papers resting on the black marble table. He could not hide the absolute ravenous hunger in his gaze. He took his seat across from me, pulling the heavy leather chair close to the table. He looked up at Oliver with a tight, polite smile, trying to project the image of a responsible, grieving son. Oliver did not return the smile. He stood at the head of the table, radiating cold, absolute authority. He looked down at Colin and began to speak in a rapid, flat monotone. He explained that these documents would establish an irrevocable joint trust and transfer complete administrative control of the $4 million estate into Colin's name upon my medical incapacitation. Oliver used dense, complicated legal terminology, deliberately burying the actual mechanics of the trap under thick layers of sophisticated jargon. He spoke of fiduciary proxy mandates and unilateral asset reallocation. He told Colin that because of the extreme emergency medical timeline, he needed to sign every single page marked with a yellow flag immediately. Colin did not hesitate for a single second. He did not ask for a moment to read the clauses. He did not ask to have his own attorney review the massive contract. Greed had completely blinded him to basic common sense and self-preservation. He picked up the heavy silver fountain pen and began to write. I sat in my chair, pretending to struggle for breath, while I watched him sign his name over and over again. The sharp scratch of the metal nib against the thick parchment paper echoed loudly in the quiet, acoustic boardroom. Page after page, he willingly signed away his entire life. He signed the waiver acknowledging absolute financial transparency. He signed the asset transfer authorizations that actually gave Oliver access to audit all of his personal accounts. He was moving so fast his signature began to degrade from a neat cursive script into a frantic, jagged scribble. He thought he was locking down a generational fortune. He thought he was outsmarting a dying old man and securing a lifetime of extreme luxury for himself and Vanessa Croft. He flipped aggressively to the second stack of documents. Oliver calmly explained that these were the secondary guardianship and liability transfers required by the state to finalize the estate bypass. Colin just nodded aggressively, not even looking up from the paper. He was sweating slightly now. A small bead of moisture formed on his forehead and rolled down his temple as he reached the final pages of the second stack. He was like a starving animal devouring poisoned meat, completely unaware of the venom entering his bloodstream. He flipped to the very last page of the massive legal stack. He pressed the pen down hard, leaving a dark, permanent pool of ink on the final signature line. He let out a long, heavy breath of pure relief and dropped the silver pen onto the black marble. He looked up at me with a bright, triumphant smile. He told me it was done. He told me I did not need to worry about anything ever again. He promised me he would take perfect care of the family and make sure Lily had the best life possible. Hearing him use her name as a prop while he believed he was stealing my money sent a shockwave of pure rage through my nervous system. But I kept my face slack and weak. Oliver silently stepped forward and gathered the entire stack of signed documents. He tapped the edges against the marble table, aligning them perfectly. Then he slid the paperwork into a thick leather portfolio and closed the cover. The ink was dry. The contract was executed. Oliver reached under the thick edge of the polished marble table. He pressed a small concealed security button. A heavy metallic click echoed loudly through the room. It was the distinct sound of electronic deadbolts engaging simultaneously on the thick mahogany doors. The sound was so absolute and final that Colin physically flinched in his chair. He looked back over his shoulder at the doors and then turned his head to look back at Oliver. The triumphant, greedy smile began to falter on his face, replaced by a sudden creeping confusion. He asked Oliver why the doors had just locked. Oliver did not answer him. Oliver simply stepped back from the table and crossed his arms over his chest, staring down at Colin with eyes full of utter predatory contempt. I took a slow, deep breath, filling my lungs completely. The shallow, rattling cough disappeared from my throat. I rolled my shoulders back, feeling my spine straighten out. I sat up tall in my leather chair, gripping the edge of the black marble table with strong, steady hands. The elaborate illusion of the frail, dying old man evaporated instantly into the cold air of the boardroom. I let the mask fall away entirely, revealing the cold, calculating hunter underneath. Colin stared at me, his brow furrowed in deep, terrified confusion. He watched my physical posture change. He watched the manufactured weakness leave my face entirely. His eyes darted from my steady hands up to my perfectly calm eyes. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly heavy. I reached down into the leather briefcase resting on the floor by my feet. I pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. I placed it gently on the black marble table. I pressed my hand flat against the cardboard cover and slowly pushed it across the smooth, reflective surface. It glided silently, stopping exactly 3 inches from his trembling hands. I looked directly into his eyes, letting 8 years of grief and anger distill into a single piercing stare. I told him to open the folder. I kept my right hand resting flat against the thick cardboard cover of the manila folder. Colin stared at it. His breathing was suddenly very loud in the quiet acoustic boardroom. He asked me what it was, trying to inject a tone of polite concern into his voice, but the underlying vibration of fear was entirely obvious. I did not answer him immediately. I let the absolute silence of the room stretch out until the tension became almost unbearable. I wanted him to feel the exact weight of the moment. Then I slowly lifted the cardboard cover and folded it back. I reached inside and pulled out the first piece of paper. It was the high-resolution copy of the life insurance waiver Oliver had printed from the digital archives. I placed it face up on the polished black marble and slid it slowly across the smooth surface. It glided silently, stopping exactly 2 inches away from the silver fountain pen he had just used to sign his life away. I told him to look at the signature at the bottom of the page. I told him it was an absolute masterpiece of forgery. Colin looked down at the paper, and the last remaining drop of color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a quiet, terrifying calm that filled every corner of the room. I told him Oliver had kept the digital archives from Rachel's estate. I told him I knew my daughter had never missed a single premium payment in her entire life because she was a brilliant actuary who never made mistakes with risk. I told him the insurance company had paid out exactly $1.2 million precisely 3 weeks after we buried her. Colin began to shake his head rapidly from side to side. He gripped the armrests of his heavy leather chair so tightly, his knuckles turned completely white. He stammered, trying desperately to form a coherent sentence. He said it was a massive misunderstanding. He said the insurance company had made a clerical error and he had just signed my name to protect me from the unnecessary stress of dealing with the paperwork while I was grieving. The lie was so incredibly pathetic and weak, it was almost physically offensive to hear. I did not let him continue his pathetic fabrication. I reached into the folder again and pulled out the forensic financial reports. I spread them out across the black marble table like a card dealer laying out a winning hand. I read the routing numbers aloud. I listed the exact names of the dummy corporations registered in Delaware that he used to launder my annual wire transfers. I detailed the offshore holding accounts where he had hidden my daughter's legacy. Then I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cold stone. I looked directly into his panicked, terrified eyes. I asked him how Vanessa Croft was enjoying the panoramic view from the downtown penthouse. Hearing her name was the physical blow that finally shattered him. He recoiled violently in his chair, as if I had reached across the table and struck him across the face. He realized the engagement party last night was not a bizarre accident. He realized the old gullible fool he thought he was manipulating had actually mapped out every single hidden corner of his secret reality. He told me I was crazy. His voice was shrill and cracking. He said I had absolutely no right to look into his private business and that his financial investments had nothing to do with Lily. I ignored his frantic defensive posturing completely. The financial theft was just the opening move. I reached into the folder one last time. I pulled out the thick stack of glossy photographs I had printed earlier that morning. I did not slide these carefully across the table. I threw them down with sudden, violent force. They scattered across the black marble, overlapping each other. There was a clear high-definition photograph of the heavy industrial steel padlock secured tightly to the kitchen refrigerator door. There was a picture of the locked wooden pantry. There were multiple devastating photos of Lily's freezing bedroom showing the small stained mattress resting directly on the bare wooden floorboards and the thick white frost clinging to the inside of the single-pane window. Colin stared at the scattered photographs, and his lower jaw began to tremble uncontrollably. He knew exactly what he was looking at. I told him I had used the emergency brass key yesterday afternoon while he was downtown preparing for his lavish party. I told him I had easily bypassed his cheap off-the-shelf security system. I tapped my chest right over my inside coat pocket. I told him I had the entire 6-month archive of his home security monitoring footage copied onto a high-capacity flash drive sitting right next to my heart. I described the video from last Friday in vivid, agonizing detail. I told him I watched the silent footage of him dropping a tiny plastic bag of expired snacks on the floor and abandoning his 10-year-old daughter for 48 straight hours so he could go drink vintage champagne in the sky. He was completely and utterly destroyed. The arrogant, fake billionaire who had walked into the room 5 minutes ago was entirely gone. He was reduced to nothing but a terrified, desperate criminal backed into a corner with absolutely no way out. He looked away from the photographs and turned his desperate gaze toward Oliver. He pointed a violently shaking finger at the heavy leather portfolio containing the massive stack of documents he had just finished signing. He begged Oliver to tell him what was going on. He shouted that he was the primary co-trustee of a $4 million estate. He demanded that Oliver honor the legal contract he had just executed. Oliver stood perfectly still at the head of the marble table. He looked down at Colin with a cold, absolute disgust that was entirely devoid of professional courtesy. Oliver spoke, and his voice was heavy and unyielding. He told Colin there was no $4 million trust. He told Colin I did not have stage 4 pancreatic cancer and that I was in perfect physical health. He explained that every single word I had told him on the phone that morning was a carefully constructed lie designed specifically to bypass his natural paranoia and exploit his massive, blinding greed. Colin grabbed the edge of the marble table trying to stand up, but his legs simply would not support his body weight. He sank back down heavily into the leather chair. He looked at his own right hand still stained with black ink. He asked Oliver in a hollow, defeated whisper what he had just signed. Oliver slowly opened the leather portfolio and pulled out the top page of the first heavily flagged stack. He began to read the actual legal clauses aloud in a booming, authoritative voice that left absolutely no room for misinterpretation. He informed Colin that Section 4 of the primary document he had rushed to sign was not an asset transfer authorization. It was a complete, unconditional, and permanent, irrevocable surrender of all his parental rights to Lily. The clause granted me sole, permanent, legal, and physical custody of my granddaughter, effective the exact second his pen left the paper. Colin let out a choked, agonizing gasp. He reached out his trembling hands as if he could magically grab the paperback from across the long table and tear it to pieces. But Oliver was not finished dismantling his life. He flipped to the second stack of documents. He told Colin that the secondary liability forms were not standard estate tax exemptions. They were actually a comprehensive, legally binding sworn admission of guilt. He explained that Colin had just signed a full, detailed confession, verifying his orchestration of multiple counts of federal wire fraud, grand larceny, and identity theft regarding the $1.2 million life insurance payout. The illusion was now entirely dismantled. Colin had walked into the boardroom believing he was about to secure a massive generational fortune. Instead, his own ravenous greed had completely blinded him. In less than 5 minutes, he had legally given away his only child and handed the federal government a perfectly executed confession to his own massive financial crimes. He realized the Trojan horse had not just breached his walls, it had burned his entire kingdom to the ground. He looked at the scattered photos of the padlocked refrigerator. He looked at the forged insurance waiver. Then he looked at me. He finally understood that the man sitting across from him was not a victim. He began to weep. It was not the fake theatrical crying he had used at my daughter's funeral to extract my sympathy. It was the ugly, pathetic, hyperventilating sobbing of a man who suddenly realizes his life is completely and permanently over. I sat in my chair and watched him cry. I felt absolutely no pity for him. The checkmate was absolute, and the board was entirely cleared of his poison. Colin sat slumped in the heavy leather chair, his face buried in his ink-stained hands. His pathetic sobbing was the only sound in the massive acoustic boardroom. I watched his shoulders heave and felt absolutely nothing. There was no residual affection and no guilt. He had built his entire existence on a foundation of lies, and now that foundation had crumbled to dust. Oliver stood at the head of the polished black marble table, looking down at the broken man with the cold detachment of an executioner whose job was already done. We did not need to say another word to him. The private phase of his destruction was completely over. It was time to invite the real world into the room. Oliver reached under the thick edge of the marble table one last time. He pressed the concealed security button. A heavy metallic click echoed loudly through the room as the electronic deadbolts disengaged. The mahogany doors did not just unlock. They were immediately pushed open from the outside. The heavy doors swung wide, and the quiet, insulated atmosphere of the boardroom was instantly shattered by the harsh reality of consequence. 3 people walked into the room, moving with a swift, coordinated purpose that left no room for negotiation. 2 of them were tall, broadly built men, wearing plain, dark suits. Their posture and the hard, professional set of their jaws identified them instantly as seasoned, plainclothes detectives. They did not look at the expensive artwork on the walls or the panoramic view of the city. Their eyes locked directly onto Colin. Flanking them was a sharp-looking woman wearing a practical gray pantsuit. A silver badge hung clearly visible from a thick leather lanyard around her neck. She carried a thick manila folder tucked tightly under her left arm. Colin stopped sobbing abruptly. He lowered his hands from his face and stared at the 3 strangers entering the room. The last remnants of his arrogant billionaire persona vanished entirely, replaced by the raw, instinctual terror of a trapped animal. He pushed his leather chair back slightly, the wheels squeaking loudly against the hardwood floor. He looked at Oliver, and then he looked at me, his eyes wide and frantic. He did not understand how fast the trap was closing. The woman in the gray suit stepped forward first. She did not introduce herself with a handshake. She spoke with a clear, ringing authority that cut right through his rising panic. She stated her name and identified herself as a senior investigator for the State Department of Child Protective Services. She placed her manila folder on the edge of the black marble table. She looked directly into Colin's eyes and told him she had spent the last 2 hours reviewing the high-definition video files I had provided to her office at dawn. She did not mince her words. She described watching the footage of him abandoning his 10-year-old daughter in a freezing house for entire weekends. She mentioned the heavy steel padlock on the refrigerator. She told him that in her 15 years of investigating child abuse, she had rarely seen such calculated systemic starvation and emotional neglect from a biological parent with such vast financial resources. Colin tried to speak. He opened his mouth to formulate another pathetic lie to claim the videos were doctored or taken out of context. The investigator cut him off instantly. She raised her hand, silencing him before a single word could escape his throat. She told him she was not there to interview him or hear his excuses. She pointed to the heavy leather portfolio resting in front of Oliver. She informed Colin that based on the undeniable video evidence and the unconditional surrender of parental rights he had just voluntarily signed under penalty of perjury, his custody of Lily was permanently terminated. She told him an emergency extraction team was already at the suburban house packing Lily's meager belongings and bringing her to a safe, secure location until I was ready to take her home. The absolute finality of her words struck Colin like a physical blow. He realized he had lost his only piece of leverage. The human collateral he had used to extort me for 8 years was gone forever. He could no longer use my granddaughter as a shield or a bargaining chip. Before Colin could even process the loss of his child, the lad detective stepped up right beside the investigator. He did not carry a folder. He carried a pair of heavy steel handcuffs hooked over his leather belt. He addressed Colin in a deep, gravelly voice that commanded absolute obedience. He announced that he was executing a felony arrest warrant issued just 30 minutes ago by a federal magistrate. He rattled off the charges with mechanical precision. Grand larceny, wire fraud, criminal forgery, and felony child endangerment. The detective explained that the state had already frozen the Delaware shell companies and the offshore holding accounts based on the forensic evidence Oliver had submitted. The reality of federal prison finally crashed down on Colin. The fight or flight response seized his nervous system completely. He looked at the massive glass windows behind him, realizing he was trapped on the top floor of a skyscraper. He looked at the 2 large detectives blocking the only exit. Absolute panic erased whatever rational thought he had left. He made a desperate, foolish decision. He kicked his chair back violently, sending it crashing into the wood-paneled wall. He lunged forward, trying to dart around the black marble table and slip past the investigator toward the open door. He did not even make it 3 steps. The younger detective moved with terrifying speed. He grabbed Colin's expensive tailored suit jacket by the lapels, twisting the fabric tight and halting his momentum instantly. The lead detective stepped in, grabbing Colin's right arm and sweeping his leg out from under him. Colin slammed hard onto the polished black marble table face first. The sound of his jaw hitting the cold stone echoed through the room. The detective wrenched his arms behind his back. The sharp, ratcheting click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists was the loudest sound I had heard all morning. Colin thrashed against the marble, acting like a wild animal. The side of his face was pressed flat against the table right next to the scattered photographs of Lily's freezing bedroom. He twisted his neck and locked his wild, furious eyes on me. He began to scream. He shrieked that I had tricked him. He yelled that I was a manipulative monster who lied about having terminal cancer just to ruin his life. He screamed that he was going to sue me for everything I owned and destroy my reputation. His voice echoed off the acoustic wood, a pathetic symphony of denial and rage. I did not move from my chair. I did not raise my voice. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table, and looked down at him. I told him he had ruined his own life the moment he forged my signature and decided his luxury was worth more than his daughter's survival. I told him I did not trick him. I simply opened a door and let his own ravenous greed walk him straight into a prison cell. The lead detective hauled Colin roughly to his feet. Colin stumbled, his perfectly groomed hair now a messy tangle over his sweating forehead. He continued to scream, cursing me and Oliver, demanding his phone so he could call his own lawyers. He yelled that he had a multi-million-dollar penthouse and he would post any bail they threw at him. He shouted that he would be back in his luxury high-rise before the sun went down. The detective stopped walking and pulled Colin back slightly, yanking the handcuffs upward to force compliance. A grim, humorless smile touched the detective's face. He leaned in close to Colin's ear, speaking loud enough for all of us to hear. He told Colin he was not going back to the penthouse today or any other day. He explained that because the property was purchased entirely with stolen funds laundered through fraudulent offshore accounts, it was currently classified as the primary scene of a massive federal crime. The detective paused, letting the information sink in. Then he delivered the final devastating blow. He told Colin that at this exact moment, a heavily armed team of federal agents from the Internal Revenue Service was actively raiding the downtown high-rise. He told Colin they were currently tearing apart the custom marble floors, seizing the expensive imported furniture, and locking down the entire building. The detective added casually that the agents had already encountered a woman named Vanessa Croft inside the residence. He noted that she was currently being detained and questioned regarding her complicity in receiving stolen funds. Colin's screaming stopped instantly. His jaw dropped open. His eyes glazed over as the sheer magnitude of his absolute total ruin washed over him. He was not just losing his freedom. He was losing the stolen money, the fake prestige, and the woman he had built the entire miserable illusion for. He was utterly, entirely bankrupt in every possible definition of the word. He went completely limp in the detective's grip, his legs refusing to support him. The two men had to practically drag him by his arms out of the boardroom. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind them, leaving the room in perfect, satisfying silence. I rode in the passenger seat of the unmarked police vehicle, following the transport van that carried the man who had destroyed my daughter's legacy. Oliver sat in the back seat, reviewing the digital files on his secure tablet. We were heading to the Central Federal Precinct downtown. The transition from the silent, acoustic boardroom to the harsh, chaotic reality of the criminal justice system was jarring, but absolutely necessary. I needed to see this through to the very end. The lead detective had asked me to come along to the station to provide a formal recorded statement and to verify any offshore account details that might arise during the initial booking process. I walked into the precinct, and the smell of stale coffee and industrial floor cleaner hit my senses. It was a bleak, sterile environment entirely devoid of the luxury and comfort Colin had grown completely accustomed to. The detective led me and Oliver into a small, dimly lit observation room. One entire wall was made of thick, reinforced one-way glass, looking directly down into the primary holding and processing area. I stood in the shadows and looked through the heavy glass. Colin was sitting on a bolted metal bench inside a chain-link holding cell. They had taken away his expensive velvet dinner jacket, his silk tie, and his leather belt. He sat there in his wrinkled dress shirt, looking incredibly small and frail. His platinum luxury watch had been confiscated and sealed in a clear plastic evidence bag. The physical transformation was astonishing. Stripped of his stolen wealth and his designer clothes, he was just a desperate, terrified man waiting for the crushing weight of the federal government to finally break his spine. The lead detective entered the observation room and stood beside me. He pointed to a small digital speaker mounted on the wall. He explained that federal suspects arrested for massive wire fraud and offshore laundering are subjected to mandatory call monitoring to prevent the destruction of evidence. He flipped a switch on a metal console. The detective told me Colin was about to be granted his single legally mandated phone call. He said Colin had refused to call a defense attorney. Instead, he had demanded to call his fiancée. The detective adjusted the volume dial. He told me to listen closely and identify any bank names or account routing phrases Colin might try to pass to her. Through the heavy glass, I watched a uniformed officer hand Colin a heavy black telephone receiver through the chain link mesh. Colin grabbed it with trembling hands. He punched in the numbers with frantic, desperate speed. He pressed the plastic receiver hard against his ear. Inside the observation room, the digital speaker cracked to life, emitting a sharp, ringing tone. The sound echoed in the small, dark space. Colin was banking his entire survival on this single call. He believed Vanessa was his ultimate safety net. He believed the woman he had showered with stolen millions would simply log into their hidden accounts, wire the massive bail money, and hire the best corporate defense lawyers in the city to set him free. He still believed his fake world had one pillar left standing. The ringing stopped. The line connected. Vanessa answered, but she did not offer a sweet or loving greeting. Her voice came through the speaker high-pitched and laced with absolute raw panic. She sounded completely breathless. Colin did not even ask if she was okay. His own selfish desperation consumed him entirely. He spoke rapidly, his voice cracking under the strain. He told her he was locked up at the Central Precinct. He said it was a massive misunderstanding about my daughter's estate. He begged her to go into his home office, open the wall safe, and access the encrypted laptop. He pleaded with her to immediately wire $200,000 from the primary island holding account to a local bail bondsman. He told her she had to do it right now before the banks closed for the day. Vanessa did not respond to his frantic instructions. The audio feed from her end of the line was filled with chaotic background noise. I could hear heavy boots stomping across marble floors. I could hear the sound of wooden drawers being violently pulled open and emptied. I could hear the sharp, commanding voices of federal agents giving orders to secure the perimeter of the penthouse. She finally spoke, and her words completely shattered Colin's last remaining hope. She told him he was out of his mind. She said there were 20 armed agents from the Internal Revenue Service tearing their luxury apartment apart. She said they had already seized her phone, her passport, and her designer luggage. Her voice trembled as she described agents pulling the imported artwork off the walls and ripping up the floorboards, looking for hidden cash. Through the glass, I watched Colin's posture collapse even further. He hunched over the metal bench, clutching the phone as if it were a physical lifeline. He begged her again. He told her the offshore money was secure and untouchable. He pleaded with her to just find a way to log in and send the funds. Vanessa let out a sound that was half sob and half bitter laugh. The reality of the situation had clearly caught up to her. She was a woman who had traded her youth and loyalty for absolute financial security. She was a creature of luxury and pragmatism. She told Colin that a senior federal agent had just pulled her aside into the kitchen. She said the agent had shown her the exact forensic tracking documents Oliver had compiled. She told Colin she had just seen the undeniable proof that every single dollar in their bank accounts, every piece of furniture in their home, and the very roof over their heads was paid for with a stolen life insurance payout belonging to a dead woman. The tone of her voice shifted dramatically. The panic began to recede, replaced by a cold, calculating survival instinct. She told him the federal agent had pointed directly at the massive diamond engagement ring on her finger. The agent had explained the legal definitions of receiving stolen property and accessory to wire fraud. She said the agent offered her a single fleeting window of opportunity to avoid being indicted as a co-conspirator. Colin began to hyperventilate. I could hear his ragged breaths coming through the digital speaker. He realized what was happening. He begged her not to listen to them. He swore he would fix everything and protect her. He pleaded with her to just stay loyal and fight the charges with him. Vanessa cut him off completely. Her voice was entirely devoid of warmth or affection. It was the voice of a woman cutting a dead weight loose to save herself from drowning. She told him she was 30 years old, and she absolutely refused to spend the next 2 decades in a federal penitentiary because he was a sloppy, arrogant thief. She told him she did not love him enough to wear an orange jumpsuit for the rest of her youth. Then she delivered the absolute fatal blow to his criminal empire. She told him she was standing right in front of the open wall safe. She said she was holding the physical backup drive that contained all of his encrypted passwords, his offshore routing numbers, and the digital ledgers he used to launder my daughter's money. She told Colin she was handing the drive directly to the senior federal agent right now, in exchange for a signed immunity agreement. Colin screamed into the phone. It was a guttural, animalistic sound of pure agony and total defeat. He shrieked her name, begging her to stop, begging her to just hang up and walk away. She did not hesitate. She told him goodbye and she ended the call. The digital speaker in the observation room emitted a harsh, flat dial tone. The sound was incredibly loud, filling the small, dark space with the undeniable reality of his complete isolation. I looked through the reinforced glass. Colin sat frozen on the metal bench, staring blankly at the black plastic receiver in his hand. The dial tone hummed in his ear, a continuous electronic hum that signaled the absolute end of his life. He slowly lowered the phone, letting it dangle by its short metal cord. The uniformed officer stepped forward and took the receiver away, locking the heavy metal door of the holding cell. Colin slowly raised his hands and buried his face in his palms. He did not scream anymore. He did not cry. His body just began to shake with silent, violently suppressed tremors. Every single person he had tried to manipulate had turned against him. The old man he thought he was extorting had orchestrated his downfall. The lawyer he thought was a fool had trapped him in a legally binding confession. And the woman he had stolen millions to impress had traded him to the federal government to save her own skin. He was utterly, entirely alone. He had no money. He had no family. He had no allies. He had absolutely nothing left but the cold, concrete floor of a federal holding cell and the crushing certainty that he would never walk out into the free world again. I turned away from the glass, feeling a deep, profound peace settling over my soul. The betrayal within his own ranks was the perfect final chapter to his miserable story. I nodded to the lead detective, thanking him for his time, and walked out of the observation room, ready to go secure the only thing that truly mattered. 2 weeks had passed since the heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom closed on Colin's previous life. The frantic chaos of the arrest, the asset seizures, and the emergency custody hearings had settled into a cold, permanent reality. I drove out to the federal detention center on a bleak Thursday morning. The facility was a massive, brutalist fortress of gray concrete and coiled razor wire sitting on the edge of the industrial district. It was a place designed to completely strip away human dignity and replace it with absolute institutional control. I parked my truck and walked toward the heavily fortified visitor entrance. The freezing wind whipped across the barren parking lot, but I felt a strange, comforting warmth radiating from within my chest. I was not coming here to seek closure. I was coming here to build a permanent concrete wall between his rotting world and my family. The security processing was slow and deeply dehumanizing. I emptied my pockets, took off my belt, and walked through the scanning machines. Every heavy steel door that slammed shut behind me echoed with a resounding metallic clang. A completely indifferent guard led me down a long, brightly lit corridor painted a sickening shade of institutional green. We arrived at the high-security visitation block. The room was divided down the middle by a thick wall of scratched, impenetrable plexiglass. There were no chairs, just cold metal stools bolted directly to the concrete floor. A black plastic telephone receiver hung on the wall at each station. The air smelled of industrial bleach and stale sweat. I sat down on the hard metal stool and folded my hands on the small counter. I waited in the silence. A few minutes later, the heavy steel door on the opposite side of the glass buzzed loudly and slid open. 2 armed guards escorted a prisoner into the secure booth. The physical transformation of the man walking toward the glass was absolutely staggering. It had only been 14 days, but Colin looked as though he had aged a decade. He was wearing a bright neon orange jumpsuit that hung loosely off his frame. The luxurious, tailored fit of his bespoke suits was completely gone, replaced by stiff, coarse canvas. His expensive, perfectly styled hair was greasy and flat, clinging to his sweating forehead. His face was pale, deeply lined, and covered in a patchy, unkempt beard. Without the stolen wealth to prop him up, he looked incredibly small, weak, and entirely unremarkable. The platinum watches and vintage champagne were gone forever. The federal government owned every single second of his miserable existence now. He saw me sitting on the other side of the scratched plexiglass, and his entire body jolted as if he had been struck by an electric current. He practically lunged toward the partition, his hands slapping flat against the thick, clear barrier, before a guard barked a harsh command, forcing him to sit down. He collapsed onto his metal stool. His hands were shaking violently as he reached for the black telephone receiver. I slowly picked up my own receiver and pressed the cold plastic against my ear. I did not say a word. I simply looked at him through the smudged glass, letting him feel the absolute crushing weight of my silence. He broke instantly. The tears began to stream down his hollow cheeks. This was not the theatrical performance he had put on at Rachel's funeral. This was not the calculated weeping of a man trying to extort money. This was the raw, pathetic sobbing of a completely broken animal staring into the abyss of a 20-year federal prison sentence. His voice came through the earpiece, cracked and desperate. He started talking incredibly fast, his words stumbling over each other in a frantic rush to find some kind of leverage. He begged me to talk to the federal prosecutors. He begged me to tell them he was not in his right mind when he took the money. Then he did exactly what I knew he would do. He reached for the only weapon he thought he had left. He invoked my dead daughter's name. He pressed his free hand against the glass and sobbed heavily. He told me Rachel would be absolutely horrified to see her husband locked in a cage. He cried that Rachel loved him and that she would want our family to forgive each other. He claimed he had just lost his way in the grief that the money had corrupted him, but that underneath it all, he was still the man she married. He used the word family over and over again, trying to weave a pathetic emotional web to trap my conscience. He told me Lily needed her father. He said a young girl should not grow up visiting her dad in a federal penitentiary. He promised that if I just helped him secure a plea deal and reduced his sentence, he would spend the rest of his life making it up to us. He said he would go to rehab, he would work any minimum wage job, he would do whatever it took to rebuild our trust. His desperation became so overwhelming that he literally slid off the metal stool. He dropped to his knees on the hard concrete floor, entirely ignoring the guards watching him. He kneeled behind the glass, looking up at me like a starving beggar pleading for his very life. I sat perfectly still. I listened to his frantic sobbing and his pathetic promises. I let him exhaust every single emotional manipulation tactic he possessed. I watched the tears drip off his chin and stain the collar of his neon jumpsuit. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no anger. I felt nothing but a clean surgical detachment. When he finally ran out of breath and simply kneeled there, panting and crying, I decided it was time to end the conversation forever. My voice was completely flat and devoid of any emotion. I told him he lost the right to speak Rachel's name the day he forged my signature and stole her legacy. I told him he was never my family. I told him he was just a parasite who attached himself to my daughter and tried to drain us dry. I watched his eyes widen in fresh terror as my cold words dismantled his last desperate hope. Then I delivered the final absolute boundary. I leaned slightly closer to the scratched glass. I told him to listen to me very carefully. I told him about the freezing Tuesday morning when I visited the decoy house. I told him about the moment he walked into the kitchen to take a fake business call, leaving Lily alone with me in the living room. I told him exactly what his terrified, starving 10-year-old daughter had whispered into my ear while she clung to my coat. I spoke slowly, making sure every single word burned itself permanently into his brain. I said she told me to follow you, Colin. She knew you were lying. She knew you were starving her while you lived somewhere else. You thought you were so incredibly smart keeping her locked in the dark, but your own child was the one who handed me the knife to cut your throat. She knew exactly what you were, Colin. And now you are nothing. He gasped, pulling the phone away from his ear as if the plastic receiver had suddenly caught fire. His eyes were wide with a horror that went far beyond the fear of prison. He realized he had been completely exposed by the very child he considered a useless liability. He scrambled to get back onto the stool, frantically raising the phone to his mouth to scream a response. He was crying, begging, shouting for me to wait. I did not wait. I reached out and placed the heavy black receiver back onto the metal cradle. The loud click severed the connection instantly. The sound of his frantic begging was cut off, replacing his voice with the thick, dead silence of the secure visitation room. I stood up from the stool. I buttoned my wool coat and adjusted my collar. Through the thick glass, I could see his mouth moving in desperate, silent screams. He was slapping his hands against the plexiglass, the guards already moving in to pull him back. I turned my back to the glass. I walked toward the heavy steel exit door. I did not stop. I did not hesitate. And I never looked back. The concrete wall was built. The monster was locked away in the dark, and my family was finally safe. Spring came late this year, but when it finally arrived, it washed the entire city clean. I drove my truck through the tall, wrought iron gates of the Memorial Park. The morning air was crisp and smelled of damp earth and blooming dogwood trees. I rolled down the windows, letting the fresh breeze fill the cabin. For 8 long years, my drives to this cemetery were incredibly heavy. They were suffocating journeys filled with a dark, lingering grief I could never seem to shake. I used to come here carrying the weight of a broken family and the terrible, nagging feeling that I was somehow failing, the only person Rachel left behind. I used to sit behind the steering wheel feeling completely helpless. Today, my hands rested lightly on the leather. My shoulders were relaxed. The crushing, invisible burden I had carried for nearly a decade was completely gone. I parked the truck near the gently sloping hill that overlooked the eastern edge of the quiet grounds. The bright morning sunlight caught the dew on the fresh green grass, making the entire landscape look as though it had been scattered with diamonds. I turned off the engine and looked over at the passenger seat. Lily unbuckled her seatbelt. She did not hesitate or shrink into herself the way she used to just a few short weeks ago. She opened the heavy door and stepped out into the bright morning light. The physical and emotional transformation in her was nothing short of a miracle. She had been living in my home for 3 months now. The dark, bruised circles under her eyes had completely vanished. Her cheeks were full and carried a healthy, warm flush. She was wearing her brand new school uniform, a crisp white blouse and a dark blue pleated skirt with a thick, warm cardigan. She looked exactly like a 10-year-old girl should look. She looked safe. She looked loved. She no longer wore oversized frayed sweatshirts or shivered in the cold corners of a dark house. We had spent the last 90 days establishing a quiet, predictable routine. We ate hot meals together every single evening. We read books by the fireplace. We built a new life entirely free from fear and manipulation. She walked around the front of the truck and took my hand. Her grip was firm and steady. We walked up the green hill together, our footsteps falling in perfect unison on the soft earth. We reached the crest of the hill and stood before Rachel's headstone. It was a beautiful slab of polished gray granite. I looked down at my daughter's name carved deep into the stone. In the past, I would stand on this exact spot and weep silently. I would apologize to her for not being able to fix the broken pieces of her world. Today, there were absolutely no tears. There was no sorrow. There was only a profound, unbreakable peace. I felt a deep sense of completion settling into my bones. I looked at the fresh flowers someone had placed nearby, and I knew Rachel's spirit was finally at rest. She was an actuary. She understood risk, and she understood protection. She had done everything right to secure her child's future, and the monster she married had tried to tear it all down. But he had failed. He was currently sitting in a federal penitentiary, beginning a sentence that would keep him locked away until he was an old, broken man. He would never touch a single dollar of her money again. He would never be able to cast a shadow over Lily's life again. The disease had been completely eradicated from our family tree. I reached into the inside pocket of my wool coat. I pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. It was not filled with fake invoices or forged legal waivers. It contained the newly secured ironclad trust documents finalized by Oliver Stanton just yesterday afternoon. The funds had been fully recovered from the frozen offshore accounts and meticulously transferred back into a domestic portfolio. The $1.2 million plus the funds I had unknowingly surrendered over the years were now locked in a fortress of legal protection. It was structured so that no one, not even myself, could access the principal for anything other than her direct benefit. When she turned 25, she would inherit the entire estate, free and clear. I looked down at Lily. She was staring at her mother's name on the stone. I gently placed the heavy envelope into her hands. She looked up at me, her bright eyes questioning but calm. I told her that inside that envelope was everything her mother had worked so hard to build for her. I told her it was her future, completely secure and untouched. I explained that she would never have to worry about a warm coat, a hot meal, or a safe place to sleep for the rest of her life. I told her she was free to become whatever she wanted to be. Lily held the envelope tightly against her chest. She did not cry either. She just smiled a small, peaceful smile. She looked back at the headstone and whispered a quiet thank you to her mother. Then she leaned against my side, resting her head on my arm. We stood there together, bathed in the warm morning sunlight. I realized in that quiet moment that my actions over the past few months were never truly about vengeance. Revenge is a toxic fire that burns the person holding the match just as badly as the intended target. What I did was an act of pure, necessary protection. I did not destroy Colin to satisfy my own ego. I dismantled his illusion to save my daughter's legacy and to rescue my own blood. I had drawn a permanent line in the sand and defended it with everything I had. The quiet of my house was no longer the silence of loneliness. It was the silence of absolute security. The order of the world had been restored. The wicked were punished, and the innocent were sheltered. I looked out over the rolling green hills of the memorial park, feeling the gentle breeze brush past my face. I had kept my promise. I had done my job as a father and a grandfather. We turned away from the grave and walked back down the hill toward the truck, ready to start our day. We were going to go get pancakes at her favorite diner before I dropped her off at her new school. Life goes on much simpler, but infinitely more authentic than before. I learned that true family is not defined by those who demand your blind loyalty, but by those who protect your vulnerability. I learned that true love means being willing to walk into the darkness to pull your loved ones back into the light. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from today? Let us meet in the comments section below. If you appreciated this story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more life lessons like this to you. Thank you so much for your sweet support and for walking this incredible journey with me. I am looking forward to reading your thoughts on the story. On the screen right now, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend you watch next. There is so much more on my channel waiting for you. Do not forget to subscribe and hit the like button. See you in the next life story.